Can you see this? That's my knee. Oh, it's not iron. It's just a regular knee. Ah, yes. The iron knee of it all. Irony. Get it? The irony of it all? The iron knee of it all. In terms of ironic events, this is the heavy metal of all ironies. Okay. This is really heavy metallic iron knee. Okay, I apologize. This is actually a very serious topic, so enough of the theatrics. Let's get seriously serious. Here are excerpts from a letter His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada wrote regarding Srila Sridhar Maharaj in regards to what he had done after the departure of their spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. And Srila Prabhupada is writing about his guru, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Quote, still he requested his disciples to form a strong governing body for preaching the cult of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He never recommended anyone to be acharya of the Gaudiya Math. But Sridhar Maharaj is responsible for disobeying this order of Guru Maharaj. And he and others who are already dead unnecessarily thought that there must be one acharya. If Guru Maharaj could have seen someone who was qualified at that time to be acharya, he would have mentioned. Because on the night before he passed away, he talked of so many things, but he never mentioned an acharya. His idea was acharya was not to be nominated amongst the governing body. He said openly, you make a GBC and conduct the mission. So his idea was amongst the members of the GBC who would come out successfully and self-effulgent, acharya would automatically be selected. So Sridhar Maharaj and his two associate gentlemen unauthorizedly selected one acharya, and later it proved a failure. The result is now everyone is claiming to be acharya, even though they may be kanistha adhikari, with no ability to preach. In some of the camps, the acharya is being changed 3 times a year. Therefore, we may not commit the same mistake in our ISKCON camp. Actually, amongst my godbrothers, no one is qualified to be acharya. This letter is written by Srila Prabhupada to Rupanuga, and it was dated 28th of April, 1974. I will elaborate more on this letter in the ancillary note. The link is here on the screen. But for now, I want to only point out the sheer irony that the GBC actually sought the guidance of Sridhar Maharaj on this very same issue under the very same circumstances. Srila Prabhupada wrote that it was this very same Sridhar Maharaj who was responsible for disobeying Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's order regarding how the disciplic session will continue after their guru had departed, and how the next guru will become known or selected or not selected. Imagine. and for the same issue, the same topic, the same person, the GBC go to him. Srila Prabhupada points out that Sridhar's ideas were unauthorized and that the results ended in total failure. Actually, it was a result of Sridhar's ideas on this very same topic, selecting gurus after the previous acharya has passed. His ideas and advice on this very same exact issue, the entire Gaudiya Math mission became torn apart and disintegrated. I would hope now that it's clear why, by taking this into consideration, I say it was so unbelievably heavy ironic for the GBC to have approached this very same Srila Sridhar Maharaj to gain his guidance on this very same issue under the very same circumstances. How Srila Prabhupada must have felt when this was taking place. Why would Srila Prabhupada have left this world and left the GBC in total darkness without giving any guidance at all on how to proceed on this most important topic, at least regarding the path the GBC had taken. And yet, instead, just before he departs, he instructs them that the GBC can seek Sridhar's guidance on philosophical issues that they may find themselves in the dark about. It makes absolutely not a grain of sense. In light of what Srila Prabhupada wrote in this letter regarding Sridhar and his ideas regarding how the disciplic line should go on after the Acharya departs, it's painfully obvious to many of us that our Srila Prabhupada would have in no way wanted the GBC to seek Sridhar's guidance on this exact topic under the exact same circumstances. Some devotees argue that possibly Srila Prabhupada never told the GBC can seek Sridhar's philosophical advice. They argue that Tamal must have made this up. But others have collaborated that this is what Srila Prabhupada had said, and therefore it does appear that Srila Prabhupada did give this advice, that the GBC can seek Sridhar's help on philosophical issues, but that they can't resolve on their own. But if that is the case, and the evidence points to it being so, then the only thing that makes sense, any sense, is that Srila Prabhupada never intended or instructed the GBC, the GBC to go down this path of the dark side. The multi-guru path. He wouldn't have left without shedding the full light of his own guidance on this path. He simply would not have left them in the total darkness such as this on such an important issue and give them the instruction that they can go and seek Sridhar's guidance if they find themselves on the dark on an issue. In all, or at least many other ways, Srila Prabhupada did find Srila Sridhar's understanding of our philosophy to be good. Therefore, if we theoretically accept that Srila Prabhupada only intended that we go down the Rtvik Ras path, then it makes sense that he would have given the advice to the GBC that they could, on other philosophical questions that they find themselves in the dark on, that they can seek Sridhar's advice, but not regarding this specific issue. The other irony is that if Srila Prabhupada had wanted 11 men to immediately become gurus, it made for a very awkward situation where ISKCON's newly adorned gurus are now seeking the guidance of a senior Vaishnav who himself was a guru in his own separate ashram where he accepts his own disciples. The awkward difficulty this could cause, and the GBC were themselves very aware of it, was for the new members of ISKCON. Many had aspired to become Srila Prabhupada's own direct disciple. But now that he had departed, according to the GBC, they now had to surrender to one of these new 11 acharyas. But if these 11 gurus were themselves taking guidance from a godbrother of Srila Prabhupada and approaching him for their enlightenment, then why wouldn't many of the new members of ISKCON simply approach Sridhar Maharaj directly and become his direct disciple? Since he was senior to the ISKCON gurus, and in fact, those new members who would take initiation from Sridhar Maharaj would come on an equal footing with the ISKCON gurus, rather than their disciples. They would be grand disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, just as the ISKCON gurus themselves were. Besides, Srila Sridhar had been guru for many decades by that time. He was a disciple of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta even longer than Srila Prabhupada was. Why settle for someone who had never been a guru before, who has only been a devotee for just a few years, when they could become a disciple of a far more advanced guru and who was giving guidance and enlightenment to the ISKCON gurus? The GBC was well aware of this awkward situation, and so they decided that it was best for ISKCON and for them to try and keep it a secret that the GBC, and especially the new gurus, were meeting with and taking advice from Srila Sridhar Maharaj. Their policy was that the fewer who knew about this, the better. But of course, later on, when devotees came to find out, it caused a number of additional problems. As is typical when leaders try to keep secrets. Leaders keeping secrets simply breeds suspicion and distrust. A number of Prabhupada disciples who found out that the GBC were going to Sridhar thought that if the GBC can go, so can they. And as things started to go more and more sideways and insane in ISKCON, as the Zono Acharyas started falling down and going off in many different directions, many ISKCON devotees, Prabhupada disciples, and newer devotees sought Srila Sridhar's shelter from the storm. Others, when they discovered many of the GBC had been meeting with Sridhar and keeping it secret, saw it as another reason to lash out against the GBC, as they saw it as a shady cloak in darkness and was dishonest on their part. And others took it as being disloyal to Srila Prabhupada and a fall down on the part of the GBC. I'm not going to go into any more details here about the GBC's meeting with Sridhar Maharaj in March of 1978 or what all he said. That I will cover in a separate ancillary note on the March 1978 official GBC paper, The Process for Carrying Out Srila Prabhupada's Desires for Future Initiations. Flag it or click on this link for more information about that. That paper, by the way, was the first official paper that the GBC produced on this Guru issue and remained their foundational official document on this issue for many years, decades actually. That paper was written hours after their first meeting held with Sridhar Maharaj. Sridhar's own disciples had recorded that meeting, and there are actual recordings and transcripts available online that confirm that it was his guidance, Srila Sridhar's guidance, even word for word advice, that wound up becoming the foundation of this official formal GBC document regarding the official rollout of the new ISKCON gurus and how their multiple guru system was supposed to work. It's ironic that the very basis of the multi-guru path that the GBC took wasn't even based at all on Srila Prabhupada's guidance, but on the guidance of Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, the very same godbrother who had given all wrong advice and took wrong and disobedient actions on this very same issue when their guru, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, left this world. The main point I've been making here, however, is that from their very first step into this multi-guru path, the GBC had found themselves in the dark due to the fact that no guidance had been given by His divine grace at all. In hindsight, this path really looked more like a black hole leading to the dark side. It most certainly was not an enlightened path that had been carefully laid out and illuminated by ISKCON's founder Acharya, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And even with Sridhar's guidance, still the GBC and their new gurus were at a loss, with one going this way, another going that way. Soon they began bumping into the walls, bumping into each other. Then not too far down this dark path, they started tripping over their own bare feet and began falling down left and right, head over heel, and flat on their faces. Yes, sadly, so many devotees' lives suffered as a result. From the very beginning, the GBC had to seek enlightenment from other than Srila Prabhupada, from outside of his direct teachings and instructions on how to proceed down this path. And the GBC also didn't accept all the advice and guidance that Sridhar gave. And when they didn't think his advice was right, what did they do? They began to concoct their own ideas on how to proceed. The GBC started drawing their own maps, making up their own rules. Since Srila Prabhupada hadn't given them any clear guidance, he didn't lay out the map for them to follow, so they started just drawing up their own map. The GBC felt they had really no choice but to blindly try and figure out the rest on their own. They had to feel their way down the dark marg. They established their own rules for how the gurus were to function. They authorized themselves to have authority over and above such actual masters and gurus, and they authorized themselves to appoint new gurus. But according to our Srila Prabhupada, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had instructed, And I quote, this is from Prabhupada's own letter, what Srila Prabhupada himself actually stated, Acharya was not to be nominated amongst the governing body. That, end quote, that is Srila Prabhupada's own statement in his letter written. And he's quoting Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. Yet the GBC wound up going directly against the instructions of their own guru and that of the previous Acharya as well. The GBC wound up cutting through the thick, dark jungles so they could make their own concocted path. They were in uncharted territory. They were forging their own concocted path in a very dark and dense forest of Maya. Hare Krishna. This is another voice-only added insert. I felt I should explain here what I meant by saying the GBC were in uncharted territory. As we said, Srila Prabhupada had given no instruction or guidance on how these multiple gurus fit in. But the lack of guidance given by Srila Prabhupada isn't the only guidance that was lacking. The other problem was that there's no past precedence for such a situation. That is, no past Acharya had ever selected multiple successors who were all to act as gurus within one and the same ashram or ashram organization. And especially not when the previous Acharya had set up an ultimate authority for that ashram organization. So not only was there a lack of any clear instruction or guidance given by Srila Prabhupada on how this was to work, there was no past example to see how such a situation was handled in the past, because there never was a situation like this in the past. And that is why I say that the GBC had found themselves totally in uncharted territory. There was no guidance given by Srila Prabhupada, and there was no past example to look back on to see how to proceed and how this was to work. And keep in mind that the situation the GBC found themselves in wasn't due to Srila Prabhupada putting them in that situation because of his instructions. The cause of them being in that situation is the GBC had misunderstood what Srila Prabhupada was saying on May 28th. They had mistakenly thought he was going to name men who would become gurus. But that was a misunderstanding. Actually, he told them he was going to select men who would be Rtvik, which anyway, I've already spoken about, which I'll provide hard evidence for in the chronological timeline section. And so the GBC had to start making changes. They had to change the way the GBC managed ISKCON. They had to make major changes to the system Srila Prabhupada had set up. Then they had to make changes to those changes, and later more changes to the changes ad infinitum. Reminds me of that early 1960s Dylan song again. It's time for the GBC to undo the changes. Here it is, over 4 long decades, and the GBC still can't figure out exactly where they are really supposed to be and how all of this was really supposed to work. They are still making changes. Issues keep rising up, and they have to slap another bandage on top of so many other bandages. But the real cause of that illness is actually never addressed. The real cause of all this darkness on the path is very simple. It is because this isn't the path His divine grace wanted us to take. The GBC had gotten it all wrong back in May of 1977. They were never supposed to be on this dark path that leads to the dark side. On the other side, there is the Rtvik of the Acharya system path. The supporters of this path, and myself being one, say that this is the actual path that Srila Prabhupada had wanted us to follow. This path is fully enlightened, and it is enlightened by Srila Prabhupada's full guidance, which he gave in writing with his signature that clearly spelled out how we were to conduct ourselves down this path. He gave the map. He gave all enlightenment. His torchlight of knowledge is lighting this path. So let's see how different it would have been had the GBC taken ISKCON down this path instead. Well, first of all, they wouldn't have been lost. and confused as they admit they were in the months that followed Srila Prabhupada's departure, when they were trying to figure out how to go down the dark path. For this issue, there would have been no need to seek Sridhar's guidance, since Srila Prabhupada didn't leave them stranded in the dark on this path. What would the GBC's first step have been? Well, if you notice, this path is actually the same path that Srila Prabhupada had been taking us down all along. It isn't a separate path at all. As we've already explained, Srila Prabhupada gradually introduced most of the aspects of this proxy system of initiation over a 9 to 10 year period. He had delegated more and more of the physical aspects of that process to the temple presidents and various GBC men. And Srila Prabhupada had prescribed to the GBC the duties of overseeing and caring for the spiritual welfare of the members. Then, months before he departed, he finalized the 100% proxy system of initiations and instructed the GBC to start performing their Rtvik Representative duties while he was still present. So, as we see, the Rtvik Representative path wasn't a new or different path at all. It was the same path that Srila Prabhupada had been taking us down all along. He even finalized it while he was still present. For 7 years, Srila Prabhupada had established and instructed the GBC how they were to manage his mission in his absence. He instructed that they were to give the spiritual guidance to all of the members in their zones. They were to care for the spiritual well-being of all the members in their zones. They were to address the personal issues of all the members in their zones. He never spoke or even hinted of there being multiple guru masters in ISKCON who would perform those functions, well, only for their just for their disciples. He only ever instructed that the GBC was to perform those functions, and for the initiations, he had been delegating more and more of the physical, mundane aspects of that process to the temple presidents and the GBC men. Via the July 9th letter, he finalized that system, making it 100% proxy system that no longer required his physical involvement or his physical presence. And all we had to do after he departed was just to continue on that very same path he had set up for us. There was no need of any change at all, no need to veer off the path and start chopping our way through a dense, dark forest of Maya. This was the same path that he had given full illumination of his guidance on how to proceed. Before he had left, he had given his last will. And in the recording, when he dictated that will, his very first declaration was, I'll play it.
The system of management is gone as it is now. There is no need of change.
The system of management, as he had set it up, was to continue on. There was no need for changes. We were supposed to simply stay on this enlightened path that he had given us. We weren't supposed to have veered off in some concocted, dark, dense forest of multiple gurus in the one same ashram. There was no first step for the GBC to take on this path because they had already been walking down this path for years. We were already on that Rtvik Representative path. All we had to do was continue forward. Unlike Mr. Magoo's path, the multi-guru path, on the enlightened Rtvik Representative path, there were no conflicts of authority, no overlapping or competing duties performed by the Ritviks and those of the GBC, as they were between the gurus and the GBC. The Ritviks didn't compromise the authority or position of the GBC like the masters did, multiple gurus did. On this path, the duties were given by Srila Prabhupada to the GBC, and they would remain as they were without any need of change. Everything was already in its place. Everything was already functioning. All guidance needed to continue forward was already given, and the most vital aspects were given in writing. all we had to do was just stay on course down that same enlightened path that he had already been taking us on. And doesn't that really make the most sense? That this is how Srila Prabhupada would have wanted it and would have planned it? That he had already been taking us down the same path, just as he did with the GBC. Remember with the GBC, he had given them all instructions on how to manage. And several times he stepped away and removed himself from the day-to-day managing, day-to-day advice and overseeing. He stepped away and let the system operate on its own without his day-to-day involvement to see how it would work. He fully gave a dry run test or a wet run test. And on the Rtvik, he had set that up, given all instructions, had them start the process before he left. And there was not much unique about that process from July 9th forward, because most of the process he had already established. That the temple presidents make the assessments, and the GBC members had already been chanting on the beads, had already been giving spiritual names, the fire units are already being done by a GBC or temple president. All that was already in place. One last step, that now the temple presidents write their letters of recommendation, and instead of giving it to Srila Prabhupada, they'd give it to the nearest Rtvik. That was the only step that's really there that's unique in the July 9th letter. And that wrapped it up, and that made a full, proxy initiation system, that he formalized it with the title of the Rtvik Acharya. That's the same path he had set up and wanted us to continue on. Wouldn't that make most sense? Rather than he wanted that these 11 men become regular gurus, and we start adding more and more gurus, and we just veer off the path that he had been taking us on, totally disrupt the system of management that he had been working 7 years to put together and had tested it out to make sure it ran properly. Just totally disrupt that, go off into this dark path without any guidance that he didn't give us. Does that make sense? Obviously, the most sensible thing is that this is the path Srila Prabhupada had wanted us to go on. As I analyzed this, it finally became crystal clear. The path of the multiple guru path that the GBC had taken us on, it wasn't a path at all. Rather, the GBC had wandered off the intended path that Srila Prabhupada had been taking us on and wandered into a deep, dark forest of Maya. After the GBC wandered off the path, they found themselves lost in the dark jungle, and with no guidance at all. They were the ones trying to carve out a path when no path existed. No guidance had been given, no map was drawn. It was the GBC's own concocted path. It wasn't the path that Srila Prabhupada had given us. At this point, I now found myself firmly standing on the Rtvik side of the Rtvik Guru fence. It wasn't just one logical argument that brought me to this conclusion, but it was one after the other. Scenarios and arguments that I analyzed, and each one individually, based on their own separate merit, wound up pointing me to the same side. There were too many illogical and conflicting points that revealed how the multi-guru system was at total odds with the scriptural definition of what an actual guru is. It is at odds with the explicit instructions given by His divine grace. And in all these separate situations and separate scenarios, when we analyzed how things would have worked out had we stayed on the Rtvik representative of the Acharya path, all of the conflicts, all of the issues, all of the illogical scenarios, they all vanished. Srila Prabhupada had very explicitly, in many written and signed letters, prescribed duties and functions to the GBC men where they were to give spiritual guidance for all the members in their zone. They were to take care of the Krishna consciousness of all the members in their zone. They were to resolve the personal and temple issues. They were to keep the members engaged in their service, all the members in their zone. They were to provide facilities to increase our preaching projects, not gurus, but members of the GBC acting as GBC. But because the GBC introduced so many sub-gurus and sub-masters in ISKCON, the sub-gurus usurped those duties, taking them away from the GBC, but only performed them for the ones who they had performed the initiation ceremony for. This result is a dramatic and drastic change to how the GBC managed. It totally disrupted the way ISKCON was to be managed and where it was supposed to be heading. Again, what defines the true guru? The true guru gives the torchlight of transcendental knowledge that opens our darkened eyes. The guru is the spiritual master, means he is the teacher of spiritual knowledge. The Diksha Guru is he who initiates this disciple by the teachings of his transcendental knowledge. In ISKCON, that doesn't define the current gurus, it defines Srila Prabhupada. It is his torch of transcendental knowledge that is truly initiating and saving all of us, old and new members alike. While I now found myself quite firmly on the Rtvik Ras side of the fence, I still yet had to study the hard evidences and the historical facts on this issue, such as what did Srila Prabhupada actually say on May 28th, 1977, when the GBC directly asked him how he wanted initiations to be conducted in the future when he is no longer present, and other philosophical aspects also. Still, I had to address those yet. Before this, even though so many arguments and logic deductions brought me to lean toward the Rtvik side, I kept resisting them because the GBC had taken such a strong opposition to the Rtvik Ras idea. They had villainized it, demonized it so much that it wasn't an easy decision to make. It meant that I would now be totally opposing the GBC on this most all-important issue. But by now, it had become crystal clear. The path the GBC had taken us down was wrong. It was a path that had absolutely no guidance given by Srila Prabhupada. It was dark, it was full of conflicts and unresolvable issues. Yet the Rtvik Ras path was fully enlightened. It was free of all such conflicts. It was the very same exact path Srila Prabhupada had been taking us on for many years. It is the one he gave his full enlightened knowledge on and writing and all. And this brings me to the end of part 7.